Morning to everybody listening and watching. Yeah, I would like to talk about basically the effects of climate change in the Arctic on primary producers. And it's great then that Jan-Marcin Wesławski has already provided you with such a great introduction into Arctic biodiversity and ecosystem function. He was also talking about primary production. He talked about primary production in a sense like the energy that is in the system to drive its ecosystem function. And of course, all the higher life, the trophic network in the system that is depending on primary production. We would now focus on, in fact, the organisms being responsible for primary production. And this is, of course, the primary producers. And we will put particular focus on the benthic system. So that means we will focus on seaweeds. So this is a short outline. I will give you an introduction to primary production. We will revisit the basics of primary production. This might go back to your school days or your very first year in university, but maybe it doesn't mind to refresh and to realize how everything is interconnected from the smallest molecular detail towards global ecosystem functioning. We will then talk about seaweeds, its role and distribution, and its particular role as an ecosystem engineer in Arctic fjord systems, and the impacts of temperature and light. I would then like to introduce you to kind of a case study, how Arctic kelp ecophysiology might be affected in a warming winter scenario in the Arctic. Consider that particularly winter temperatures are rising in the Arctic. And then, of course, we can talk about the implications of all of that. So look at this. This is a very nice collection, I think, of, in fact, primary producers in terrestrial systems, even tropical terrestrial systems, a forest in temperate Central Europe, maybe, with the trees, also with the moss layer, with lichens. Or if we revisit the marine realm, we have, of course, also quite a variety of primary producers. Here we have a kelp forest, for example, of California, or at the Pacific coast of Canada, Vancouver. Here we have these enormous kelp forests kind of taking the same ecological function as trees in this terrestrial forest. This would be a kelp forest, a laminaria forest in our, well, Central European coasts, well, maybe at the southern Norwegian coast, or maybe at Ireland and so on. And of course, we also have plankton in the water. Yeah? So this is phytoplankton. This is, of course, the base of the pelagic food web. So all of these, and they are so different in appearance, they all have the same ecological function. They share one important ecological function. They are primary producers. So they are the base of actually everything, Also, the polar bear, of course, is relying on primary producers. The mechanism, in fact, you've heard about this, you probably forgot about how this is working, is photosynthesis. So the ultimate process, which is kind of fixing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, the process which is powered by light. And then they're using this process to build up carbohydrates, glucose, in fact. And this is kind of the compound we are all relying on. Yeah? This is what drives the system in the end, what is consumed by herbivores, which is transferred through the entire trophic food web. And as a side product, luckily for us, the primary producers in photosynthesis, as a side product, they release oxygen. The oxygen we all are depending on. We are breathing this oxygen. Sorry, this slide is in German, but it's just meant as a quick reminder again how photosynthesis is working and how photosynthesis is, of course, also depending on external factors like light and temperature. We have two two reactions, a primary light-driven reaction and a secondary reaction, which is taking place, which can take place also light independently. Light is, well, the ultimate energy source to drive this process. Basically, the idea is to conserve the energy from the light into chemical energy, and this chemical energy is ultimately used to assimilate carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's also a very nice mechanism, of course, that these plants are removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. To remove this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and to take the carbon and produce the sugar, the carbohydrates we are relying on. This primary process is driven by light. Yeah? That means if a primary producer has difficulties or is experiencing changes in the light climate, it may, of course, it has to adjust photosynthesis. It may have an issue with saturating photosynthesis, with driving photosynthesis. So light is captured by antenna, that's the chlorophyll. So they capture the energy, and we do not, of course, we do not want to go into the detail, but eventually the light energy is transferred in this chemical energy in the form of ATP. And this primary process is mostly driven by light. This chemical energy, which has just been produced, this is then now used in order to capture carbon dioxide. And this is the famous Calvin cycle. And well, be relaxed, I will not go into any further physiological detail than this. This is the carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere, and then incorporated into sugars, into glucose. So in fact, this is the carbon you are all relying on. This is the carbon all ecosystems are relying on, and this is funneled through the primary producers. This process is primarily controlled by temperature. Yeah? So an increase in temperature may speed up the process, and reduction in temperature may slow down the process. So in fact, you see already that a lot of abiotic conditions like light, temperature, and nutrients, but also, of course, all kinds of stressors, of stress factors may affect photosynthesis, and that means also biomass production. And this means, of course, if this process is affected by any kind of stress, of course, also this will be translated into ecosystem function. Probably there's no need to outline the central importance of primary producers to ecosystem function, but here, just for illustrating this one more time, I have here a picture, a trophic network from a coastal system, a coastal food web, as an example of the coast of California. And you see all these interconnections here between the different trophic levels, the herbivores, filter feeders, scavenger feeders, predators, of course, so the top of the entire food web. But of course, what is at the base? These are, of course, the producers, primary producers, and the whole system, the entire ecosystem functioning is not thinkable without those, without the contribution of these primary producers. In this case, it is seaweed. But let's leave California and let's focus on our target region. And this is, of course, the Arctic. If you think about primary producers in the Arctic, and particularly if you think about vegetation in the Arctic, from a terrestrial point of view, you may imagine this picture. This is a picture taken from Ny-Ålesund on Svalbard. This is just facing inside Kongsfjorden here with the glaciers at the end of Kongsfjorden. And here the Zeppelin mast. And what you see here, this is a very sparse vegetation. Yeah, so vegetation in the Arctic is not very dense, at least not the terrestrial vegetation. You have to look closely, then you will observe nice, very nice flowering, beautiful flowering plants, but of course, very, very sparse vegetation. And this is completely different if you would put your head underwater. So maybe this is just a couple of 100 meters away from the side, from this terrestrial side I've shown you in the previous slide. And then you would see underwater, connected to the coast, you would find this huge kelp forests. This is a kelp association in Arctic Kongsfjorden, large brown algae. This is how it looks like at Kongsfjorden underneath the water surface. And these algae, they are regarded as ecosystem engineers. So they are indeed kind of engineering the system. They provide habitat to the system. They are also regarded as a keystone species, which means if you would remove this species, then the entire system would collapse or would need to undergo reconstruction. So let's have a little bit of a closer look how it looks in between. I hope this is working. It is not. Let's see. So you see this very dense vegetation underneath in complete contrast to terrestrial vegetation. The seaweed flora there consists of about 50 to 60 different species of seaweed. And you see that basically large areas of the coastal zone in Kongsfjorden are covered by those. Okay, so this was just a very quick impression on what is seen underneath and how seaweeds are dominating the system. These seaweeds are basically brown algae, and these kind of large brown algae we call kelps. They are habitat providing, so they give shelter and habitat to associated organisms. They are perennial plants. This means they are multi-year plants. They're growing over several years, and they grow quite big, as you can see here. I like this picture a lot because this is not from an Arctic coastline, it's from an Irish coastline, but it illustrates how coastal systems could be dominated by this type of vegetation. And you could immediately imagine that there's a high number of organisms, of animals associated to this system, yeah, which are using this system as a habitat. But of course, these systems are experiencing changes and maybe also stress and threat right now as it comes to temperature change and also changes in the light climate. Temperature and light are the most important drivers of the global and vertical distribution of these kelp forests. I wanted to show you a projection about the impact of ocean warming on the distribution of seaweeds in polar and cold temperate waters. So the global distribution of seaweeds is governed by temperature. And maybe we just take the example of Laminaria hyperborea. Laminaria hyperborea is used to grow between this 2 degrees winter isotherm, that's that one here, and the 20 degrees August isotherm, which is reaching down to Galicia in northern Spain. But if you now consider an increase in temperature, the whole range, the whole distribution range will shift. That means just an increase in temperature at the southern range edge will decline, will result in a decline, in a loss of seaweed. They will die off here, and the southern distribution limit will move northward here to Brittany. On the other end, on the northern range, temperature increase, this temperature limit here will also move northward. So the whole temperature, the whole distribution range may shift northwards, and it is predicted that this species will be a new incomer into Arctic waters. It is basically growing in northern Norway, and is very, very likely that it is already at Svalbard. It has not officially been confirmed yet, but it's very, very likely that it has already made its way into Svalbard. That was a projection that former PhD student Ruth Müller has conducted in 2009, but by now I can tell you that all of this will come true. So Keep in mind temperature as the most important factor for the global distribution of seaweeds, and with shifts in temperature, also distribution ranges will change and shift. Light is, of course, important to these organisms because they are primary producers. They rely on photosynthesis. They need light to drive photosynthesis. What you can see here is the distribution of different seaweed species with depth along the coastline. This is an example from Antarctica, but never mind, this is of course similar for all coasts. The different species take particular spots along the vertical gradient where they are experiencing the light climate, which is right for them, which they are adapted to. And then consider, of course, changes in light availability. Maybe if there's an ice cover, present, less light will penetrate into the water. If there's less ice, more light will penetrate into the water. If there's more sediment, again, less light will penetrate into the water. And this may have consequences how far, how deep the different species can grow inside the water column. Coming back to temperature, this is basically what Jan Marcin also has talked about, that the flora and fauna on Svalbard is basically just a subsample of the North Atlantic flora in this case. Most of the seaweed species we find at Kongsfjorden in Svalbard here, they are also growing along the Norwegian coast, along the Irish coast, in France, in Brittany, and maybe even down to northern Spain. But what we currently are observing is the expansion of the flora into the future Arctic, into the Arctic. With temperature increase, the vegetation, the kelp forests here, they will die off. But here they grow, well, maybe under better conditions. It's a bit warmer there, so they can more easily conduct photosynthesis. So this kelp forest may expand in the future Arctic. Our study site is Kongsfjorden. Jan Marcin has introduced you to into the Kongsfjorden system already. And this system is, well, said to undergo that it underwent a shift in temperature regime in the year 2006. We can see that the temperature is increasing at Kongsfjorden in Jolesund. This is atmospheric temperature. This is a graph from our colleague Marion Maturilli from the Alfred Wegener Institute. And she has measured an average increase in atmospheric temperature by plus 1.6 degrees centigrade per decade. The interesting thing here is that this increase in temperature is not evenly distributed over the year, but it is changing in the different seasons. It's different in the different seasons. What you can see here is that the increase in summer temperatures just contribute to this overall increase just to a minor, very minor extent, but it's mostly driven by the increase in winter temperatures. Here, look at this, plus 3 degrees Celsius per decade of temperature increase during the winter. And we will revisit this because this has quite some interesting implications to our research. This temperature increase is also mirrored in the seawater temperatures. This is the famous year 2006. And you see here how winter temperatures and also summer temperatures jumped up here by about 2 degrees maybe here compared to the previous year. And you can also see that since then, if you focus on winter temperatures, they hardly went back to below 0 temperatures since then. So there was kind of a temperature shift in the system. And of course, for us, it's most interesting to see and find out how the seaweed flora is responding to this. My colleague, Inka Bartsch from the Alfred Wegener Institute and her co-workers, she conducted seaweed biomass surveys in a particular location inside Kongsfjorden. There's the island of Blomstrand, and there is a spot which is called Hansneset. At Hansneset, our divers have installed a permanent transect, which can be revisited then every now and then we can compare how the seaweed community is changing over the years. There was a first survey in the 1996, 1998, a second survey in 2012 and 13, and right now we are right back from Spitsbergen, and we have conducted a third seaweed biomass survey there. But of course, these data are right now not yet completely analyzed. So Inka Bartsch and colleagues were looking at different parameters to describe seaweed community, biomass, biodiversity, age structure, and the density of the kelp forest. This is how this works. It's not only diving, work under the water, but also work in the intertidal, basically a lot of sampling into sampling quadrats along the depth transect and collecting all kind of seaweed, not only the large kelps, maybe also this very, very tiny algae, which are of course very, very tricky to identify. And basically you need molecular tools to properly identify them. One interesting thing was already when comparing the 2012 data to the 1998 data was that there were new species coming in. So there were 20 species recorded, which were not recorded in the first survey. We cannot really tell if these were all newcomers, new incomers, or whether they have been overlooked in the first survey. This is, of course, always depending also on the taxonomic expertise of the colleagues joining the different expeditions. But we can be quite sure there's an increase in species numbers. We can, with a larger brown algae, we can make cross sections here through this stipe, and then we can determine the age of the plant. Just like in trees, we can count growth rings. And then each year they produce a growth ring, and then we can determine the age of this. And this is striking here for this brown alga Alaria esculenta in 2.5 meter water depth. We could determine that there were specimens which are about 8 years old. And this is interesting because then we can say at that water depth, if there's plants which are 8 years old, they were not affected by ice scoring during that time. So this is, of course, also ice scoring is a major driver in structuring benthic communities there, and the impact of ice was reduced at that time. Very interesting result for this particular brown alga, Laminaria digitata. If you compare the 1996-98 survey and the 2012 survey, you can see how the biomass has really enormously, tremendously increased in that 15 years. You see, there's an increase up to 4 times increase in biomass in shallow waters. This is, of course, very, very striking. But on the other side, on the other hand, and this will be seen in the next slide, we observed a decrease in depth extension. For Laminaria digitata, that was striking. This depicts the lower distribution limit. So the higher this column is, the deeper the species grow inside the water column. For Laminaria digitata, you see that the lower distribution limit was shifted upward up to 10 meters. So it's now only growing down to 10-meter water depth. And this is, of course, also a very striking result. And this indicates, of course, that less light is able to penetrate into the water column. That means that in deeper waters, the primary producers have too few light available to drive photosynthesis and to sustain themselves in the water. So they have to migrate upwards. This is a pattern which is continuously observed. So the first indications from our new survey is indicating that this trend is continuing. But this is, of course, just an example from our study site in Kongsfjord. So let's look on the Pan-Arctic perspective. And there's a very nice and a highly recommended study by Dorte Krause-Jensen and co-workers on the imprint of climate change on Pan-Arctic marine vegetation. This is basically a huge study, a meta-analysis study where she was compiling data from up to 40 different study sites and compiling time series of seaweed surveys throughout the Arctic. She was comparing the past conditions from the 1940s to 1950s towards the present conditions, and then also, of course, predicting into the future. On top, you see the past conditions, and you see, well, compared to the present condition, that ice conditions have been retreating, of course, and you have here the habitat for intertidal species and the habitat for subtidal species. On the first glance, the differences are minor, but if you have a closer look, particularly to this graph here, this is in green, you have the gain in habitat suitability for the subtidal species. So the areas which could be populated de novo by seaweed in the course of temperature increase. So newly colonized habitat by seaweed in the Arctic. Overall, the authors found an increase in the vegetated area by about 45% for subtidal and 8% for intertidal macroalgae since the 1950s. That's very interesting. You can see that the seaweed communities are migrating polewards, northwards, by about 20 kilometers per decade. So every 10 years, the northern distribution limit of seaweed has been shifted by another 20 kilometers. And there's, of course, the question, what is about the very few, Jan Martin told you about the very few endemic species, will they be able to stay in some kind of a refugia? With respect to seaweed, we are considering one particular endemic seaweed in Spitsbergen. This is Laminaria solidungula, which we could hardly find during the last 4 years indeed. Well, with temperature, of course, glaciers are melting, and the glaciers in Kongsfjorden are melting as well. And these are data provided by the Norwegian Polar Institute. And if you look at this graph here, you see all the larger glacier systems, all the larger glaciers inside Kongsfjorden are indeed retreating and well, losing their masses. The same is for the sea ice extent in Kongsfjorden. You see a comparison 2003. In March, this was the edge of the sea ice here. Compared to 2016, in March, the edge of the sea ice was here. And of course, the ice that is there is thinner. This is thinning. Ice and snow thickness are decreasing. And this has implications, of course, also to fjord ecology. This is an aerial view of Kongsfjorden, and you see here the different glaciers going into the fjord, and also the snow, of course, melting. And if glaciers are melting, discharging, and if snow is melting, they release a lot of sediment into the fjord. So what you can see here, all these sediments here, they are, of course, making the water more turbid, and this has effects on the light climate underwater. So let's talk about light climate for some minutes. Yeah, light is driving photosynthesis. So therefore, it's important to think about the light climate. The question is, of course, will macroalgal production increase because there's less sea ice? With higher water temperatures, we have less sea ice, so maybe more light will penetrate into the water. Or will macroalgal production become less because with higher temperatures we have more terrestrial runoff, we have more melting snow, and this provides more sediment into the water column? This is actually a question we were investigating during last summer. A PhD student of mine is conducting this kind of underwater measurements, spectrally resolved underwater measurements of light in the water column. And you see here the spectral distribution of energy over the wavelength for atmospheric radiation, and then for underwater radiation. This is under the very clear water conditions. And if you go into this part of the fjord, then you experience this kind of energy distribution. That's the ambient air in the atmosphere. And then you see that already within the very first few centimeters, the light is enormously absorbed. And evidently, there's less light reaching the seaweed, and there's less light available for photosynthesis. This is how it looks like. So we are running measurements from the boat. And then what we wanted to do is that we compare the light availability towards the photosynthetic capacity of the seaweed. So what we are doing is we are mimicking the light conditions underwater, and then we run photosynthesis measurements directly with the corresponding light climate as it is present underwater. Light climate in the Arctic is changing with sedimental runoff, but it's a challenge anyways in the Arctic, as you know, of course. Yeah, because as an outcome of seasonality, we have the polar night and we have the polar day. So we had conducted one particular case study in studying how do these kelps cope with winter conditions when the winters are becoming, well, constantly warmer. We have seen this temperature data, and we have seen that it's the winter temperatures that are increasing. So is this a particular challenge to the kelps? I told you about this kelp association in Kongsfjorden already, and consider this kelp association during the winter time. It is there. It's a multi-year association. They can grow over several winters, but they have no light to conduct photosynthesis for approximately 4 months. A little bit of physiology. Well, the last slide on physiology, this is that one. This is how a kelp is growing and what is happening inside the kelp during photosynthesis. It is growing from here, from the basis, and it's conducting photosynthesis over this entire leaf. What is happening is that the carbon dioxide is fixed, the carbon is fixed, and then it is transferred into a long-term sugar, into a long-term storage sugar. This is laminaran or laminarene. This is basically the same thing. This sugar, this polysaccharide, is stored and can be consumed in times of light limitation. So this is stored for the winter time, and then in the darkness, when there's no option for photosynthesis, this long-term storage can be consumed, and then it can also drive growth during the winter season. And we were interested to study how this is working under increasing winter temperatures. So we were thinking how the seaweed can cope with winterly darkness and with the winters at increasing temperatures. We were comparing 2 different species, a boreal species, Saccharina latissima, and an endemic species, Laminaria solidungula, and we wanted to compare their different responses towards increasing winter temperatures. We were actually doing 2 things. We were just sampling plants in October, just before the polar night, and in February towards the end of the polar night, and then taking samples from different parts here of the plant. And we conducted an experiment where we were exposing the different plants for 14 days, either in the light or in the dark at different temperatures. There were quite some interesting results, I have to say. Look here at just on photosynthetic performance. And we were surprised that the differences in photosynthetic performance, if we look at Laminaria solidungula, for example, here, they were not so different if we would measure in October before the polar night or right in the polar night in February towards the end of the polar night. We see we can sample the algae by divers from the polar night but they are still photosynthetically competent. We put them in the light and they start photosynthesizing immediately. To be able to conduct photosynthesis, the plants need pigments, chlorophyll that they harvest the light. And what we can see here, strikingly, there's no difference in pigment concentration in October before and after the polar night, or at the end of the polar night. This means that the whole photosynthetic machinery stays intact. It is maintained over the winter. And this is very, very new result and very striking result. But this has a cost, of course, and this is this long-term sugar, this storage polysaccharide I told you about. You can see that this is completely consumed over the winter. Here in Laminaria solidungula, which has less amount of this anyways, but it's really consumed, depleted almost entirely. That was interesting. And now we wanted to see how this is working at different temperatures. If we would expose both species, the boreal one and the high Arctic one, at different temperatures. With respect to photosynthesis, there were not so many changes going on. But again, for the consumption of this storage compound, the picture was different. And what you can see here, this is comparing light conditions and dark conditions at different temperatures, 0 degrees, 4 degrees, 8 degrees. And what we found is that with increasing temperatures, indeed, the carbohydrates are consumed faster. And this is, of course, an interesting result to consider what is happening when the winters are becoming constantly milder, warmer. Will, for example, the storage provision last over wintertime? So, as a summary of this case study, that would be very interesting. The Arctic kelps maintain their photosynthetic apparatus during wintertime. This is quite new. And the maintenance of this is fueled by this storage compound laminarine. What we also found is that laminarine consumption is higher at higher temperatures, but this is only happening in this high Arctic kelp, which is of course adapted to high Arctic conditions. And this was not the case in the more boreal kelp Zacharina latissima. And this may point to a change in interspecific competition, because Arctic kelps and boreal kelps may behave differently with climate change. And this may, of course, then also be part of the mechanisms of shifts in biodiversity of Arctic fjord systems. That was one particular case study on the kelps from Kongsfjord. But of course, we have to ask the question, how significant are these findings? Our findings are basically all from Kongsfjord, but how significant are these findings in a pan-Arctic perspective? And also, how significant are those in a societal perspective? So of course, we are doing nice, basic, fundamental science, but of course, we have to ask the question, why should the people care about this? How relevant are these results, for example, for local population in the Arctic, in Greenland, in Finnmark, and so on? To explore this, we have started a very new project, a large project, which I would just like to briefly introduce to you. This is a European project called FACEIT. FACEIT stands for the Future of Arctic Coastal Ecosystems, Identifying Transitions in Fjord Systems and Adjacent Coastal Areas. It's a large research consortium of about 14 partners from 8 countries. And I'm telling you this because you should know about this, because this may also offer opportunities for you, opportunities to cooperate and maybe work in one or the other of the FACEIT partner institutions, which you can see here. So in the end, we want to enable an adaptive co-management of Arctic fjords in the face of cryosphere change and biodiversity change. And you can see here how the research is divided into different work packages. One work package is basically pure data science, Others are focusing on biodiversity changes, ecosystem function changes. But we also have a lot of social science involved in the project, because indeed we want to explore the significance of our research to society. And one particularly interesting case is, for example, tourism, how tourism is changing now with climate change in the Arctic. Consider the pre-corona numbers in tourism. They were constantly increasing, Arctic tourism. And what is also striking is this kind of last chance tourism. The people want to go to the Arctic and see a glacier and a polar bear as long as they are still existing. And this has sparked lots of tourism activities in the last years. What we are doing is we are comparing different fjord systems throughout the Arctic. We have 7 model fjords, and we want to study fjords which we consider to be still in a healthy, in an Arctic, high Arctic stage. This would be Young Sound, so this would represent to us the stable Arctic. And then we have different fjord systems which we consider the changing Arctic, the Arctic in transition. This is evidently Kongsfjorden. There's lots of changes in Kongsfjorden now with changing temperature and so on. But also fjords on the western coast of Greenland are changing, for example, Nuukfjorden here. And then we also have one reference fjord which we are considering the future of the Arctic. And this is Porsangafjorden here in Finnmark, northern Norway. So by comparing all these fjord systems, we are thinking we can make predictions on the future of the Arctic and eventually give recommendations to management, but also to policy. Coming to an end, I wanted to quickly wrap up what I've told you. For understanding, of course, the impacts of climate change on ecosystem function, it is vital to study the primary producers, to study the base of everything. I have shown you examples on the benthic primary producers, basically on seaweeds, but of course, the system is also driven by the plankton, by microalgae, phytoplankton. So this is also a very, very important thing in terms of the carbon that is fixed by the system, the carbon that is provided to the entire trophic network. Keep in mind, light and temperature is changing. Light is also changing as a consequence of temperature change in Arctic fjord systems. And light and temperature are important drivers for the vertical and global distribution of seaweeds and of course, most of the species. As always, there will be losers and winners. And Jan Marcin has correctly pointed out, well, the Arctic will experience that there's species coming in, or species will become more abundant, which are part of the North Atlantic flora and fauna anyways, and which had been there maybe, or which are, well, they are belonging to the North Atlantic flora and fauna. So it's evident they will go further north. That's completely true. However, there are still some very few species which are cold adapted, in fact, like this kelp, Laminaria solidungula, and of course those strictly cold adapted species, they might be a loser of climate change. Overall, this is not only for seaweed, this is basically for all kind of taxa. We observe a northward migration of the different species, but as I said, maybe at the expense of the very, very few endemids. And we can say, well, why should we care? Of course, we should care in terms of maintaining biodiversity. That's, of course, it would be a loss. We do not know what we will be losing if we lose just any of these species. And of course, I think what we should, in fact, strengthen is having a better view on the societal relevance, and also taking into consideration all the different kinds of perspectives you can have also on climate change. So local community in Greenland will have, of course, completely different perspectives on the impacts of climate change. For a local fisherman will think differently, because maybe these changes will also bring opportunities to him, which we are maybe not considering from our natural science perspective. I think that was what I wanted to tell you. If you want to reach out to me here, I put my email here, so I'm happy to receive comments, questions, or whatever from you also by email, but of course also now during the discussion time. Thank you very much. I hope you liked it.